Every so often a game comes along that changes everything. Games such as Doom, Super Mario Bros., and Half-Life aren't just incredible games in their own right, they helped shape the gaming industry as a whole. And Halo Combat Evolved is one such title. As a game, Halo evolved and refined the first-person shooter, making it work on a console like never before. As a product, it helped define the first-generation Xbox and enabled Microsoft to become the juggernaut of today. And as a project, it lifted its creator, Bungie, into the history books as one of the most revered and successful developers of all time. On this episode of DF Retro, we're going to look back at the history of Bungie, explore what made Halo so special, examine its technology, and take a look at various ports released over the years. Halo is an important game to me and one I've wanted to cover for quite some time, and as a result, we have the longest episode of DF Retro to date. So, without further ado, let's get started. Like many things in the gaming industry, Bungie's history can be traced back to the original Pong. Now, cloning Pong was nothing new, but this is precisely where the Bungie story begins. A University of Chicago student by the name of Alexander Seropian released a free game for the Macintosh known as NOP. That's Pong spelled backwards. It was also exactly what you'd expect. A simple game of Pong played in black and white right on your desktop. It was a small little game for sure, but it was the beginning of something great. It wasn't long then before his second game was ready, Operation Desert Storm, an overhead war game once again designed for the Mac. Alex packaged and mailed out copies of the game from his bedroom, ultimately selling around 2,500 copies. It was around this time that Alex partnered with a fellow student from his artificial intelligence class, Jason Jones. Jason had a game of his own nearly ready for release at this time as well. It was known as Minotaur, the Labyrinths of Crete, and together with Alex, they published the game under the Bungie banner. It was from this point that the two teamed up to create something together, along with a third member they hired to create art for the next game. The trio began to work on realizing Minotaur in 3D, and the end result of these experiments was Pathways into Darkness. Pathways is a first-person dungeon crawler of sorts designed to take advantage of high-end Macintosh computers of the day. The game offers high-resolution 3D graphics and smooth scrolling. In many ways, Pathways exceeds the likes of games such as Wolfenstein 3D as a result of both clever coding and, of course, more powerful hardware. At the time, though, the Mac was not known as a place for games, with very few developers focusing on Apple's platform. So Bungie really stood out here and started to become a savior of sorts for Mac-owning gamers. But it would be their next game that truly put the small company on the map. Released in late 1994 exclusively for the Macintosh, Marathon offered Mac gamers an answer to id Software's Doom. Marathon is Bungie's first foray into the world of science fiction, and offers a moody, beautiful take on the first-person shooter. By pushing the narrative angle with things such as logs and accessible terminals, it also managed to feel incredibly fresh at the time. Marathon offered many of the same features as the Doom engine, but pushed the envelope one step further. The engine supported high-color 16 and 24-bit color modes, 640x480 output, twice that of Doom on the PC by the way, and it could even support rooms above rooms, which was impossible in the Doom engine. Marathon also featured 16-bit 22kHz audio samples with active stereo panning. In other words, it was an impressive feat for its day, though of course it did require a very powerful Macintosh in order to run its best. Over the next 2 years then, Bungie would produce two sequels, Marathon 2 Durandal and Marathon Infinity. Unlike the original, these games would be ported to the PC, in addition to existing on the Mac of course. Marathon 1 and 2 were even bundled together as Super Marathon for the PIP and Atmark, Bandai and Apple's strange failed console venture from the mid-90s. Following Marathon, Bungie continued to publish games created by other developers for the Mac, which helped cement them as a publisher of choice for Mac gamers. This includes games such as the excellent Abuse by Crack.com, a side-scrolling action game which used the mouse for aiming, or Pangaea Software's utterly bizarre Weekend Warrior, a 3D game which tasks players with taking part in a game show of sorts while playing as one of its rather strange characters. I actually played this one back in the day, and yeah, it's weird. While all this business occurred in the background, the team that had worked on Marathon had moved on to a new project, a project that would lay the groundwork for future projects in many ways. That game is Myth: The Fallen Lords. Myth is a real-time strategy game, but not just any RTS. It's a game which appears to adhere to the ideas of design by subtraction. Extraneous features are eliminated until only the highly refined core remains. Base building, resource management, and other such staples of the genre were eliminated in favor of pure strategic experience. Players would focus solely on troop management as they played through a lengthy story-driven campaign. Animated sequences were often used to great effect here as well, while the score composed by Marty O'Donnell and Michael Salvatore greatly enhanced the atmosphere. Myth is the first Bungie game on which Marty and Michael would work. The game also featured a cutting-edge 3D terrain engine complete with deformable terrain. Characters remained 2D sprites, but the camera could be rotated and zoomed freely around the battlefield with ease. The game even supported the 3DFX Voodoo graphics cards for faster frame rates and improved rendering quality. On top of all this, the game shipped on a CD-ROM which included both Mac and PC versions on the same disc. Myth was released in 1997, and it was this same year that Bungie expanded west with the opening of Bungie West. It was here where Oni was born, a third-person action game that would eventually be released on the PC, Mac, and PlayStation 2. It was an interesting game, but definitely had some flaws, including rather dull level design, but the combat systems were really cool for the time, and it had a unique look and feel. The core Bungie team then would go on to produce a sequel to Myth, known as Soulblighter, but a new project was stirring in the background, something that would forever change the fate of the company. Only, nobody had any idea that that would be the case.
We are starting to see some great games come back to the Mac. But this is one of the coolest I've ever seen. This game is going to ship early next year from Bungie, and this is the first time anybody has ever seen it. It's the first time they've debuted it. And so I'm very happy to welcome on the stage Jason Jones, who is the co-founder of Bungie and the Halo project lead. Halo is the name of this game, and we're going to see, for the first time, Halo.
It was on this stage, in 1999, that the world was first introduced to Halo, a third-person shooter being created for the Mac and PC. It was shown running using an advanced OpenGL 3D engine. From the environments to the remarkable water rendering and massive sense of scale, Halo looked unlike anything else on the market at the time. But it didn't start out that way. Internally known first as Monkey Nuts, then Blam, Halo started life as a real-time strategy game similar to Myth, only with a science fiction theme. It was during this initial phase of development where it started to become clear that the increased detail and more advanced technology would make it possible to bring the camera in closer to the action. This is how the game started to evolve, and it was this evolution that was first introduced to attendees at Macworld 99. Halo made yet another appearance then the following year at E3 2000 with this astonishing trailer. Showcasing rolling hills, massive structures, and unique gameplay ideas, Halo impressed viewers with its scale. Many of the things that we would come to know in Halo first appeared in this trailer, along with a few things that were cut from the final game. It was a glimpse of what was to come, even if the game itself at this point was very, very different. Things even got to the point where GPU manufacturers were getting in on the game. Nvidia's famous Halo promo, for instance, highlights a very different time indeed.
Hardware like Jeeps, tanks, or dropships. I'm talking about graphics hardware. Now that we're waging an epic guerrilla war against the Covenant Horde, I'm sure glad I'm packing an NVIDIA GeForce 2 GTX. Aha!
Whoa. Nice frame rate.
Thanks.
I'm okay with this. Of course, under the Take-Two Interactive banner, Halo was also said to be planned for the PlayStation 2, though Bungie never actually had the game running on Sony's hardware, mind you. Halo was shaping up to be something very interesting, and it was on the radar of many of us at the time. Of course, Microsoft was also working on some big plans.
Microsoft is announcing the breakthrough game console called Xbox.
They were getting into the game console business with Xbox, and part of its plans included acquiring talented developers and software to launch alongside the new box. One such developer was, of course, Bungie. In a legendary move, Microsoft purchased up Bungie and Halo, while Take-Two retained the rights to Myth and Oni. This was viewed as a betrayal in some circles. After all, Bungie had been a huge proponent of the Macintosh, and now they were creating software exclusively for its chief competitor, Microsoft. But this offered Bungie an opportunity to focus, to create Halo for a single, custom platform, and make certain that all users could have the same experience. They would have access to the latest technology, enabling them to push Halo further than ever. Halo appeared again during Microsoft's E3 2001 press conference video, just 6 months away from launch. The game looked somewhat rough at this point, with lots of screen tearing present and a rather low overall frame rate. And really, it was games like Dead or Alive 3 that had the most people talking about the Xbox due to its high frame rate and beautiful visuals. In many ways, it felt like Halo kinda snuck up on everybody. But that all changed come November. Halo launched alongside the Xbox in November of 2001, and it was a very different game than what Bungie had first envisioned. It was also developed in a very short period of time, but ultimately the results speak for themselves. Halo was a phenomenon. The campaign wowed players, and the multiplayer kept them hooked. This was console shooting done right. Halo was the game that single-handedly helped define the Xbox as a serious gaming platform. There were plenty of great launch titles, no doubt, but none of them managed to grab onto gamers quite like Halo. To understand what Halo does so well, though, we need to consider it in parts. Halo makes great strides in terms of core gameplay systems, the narrative, graphics and technology, the audio, and a wealth of features. It's the complete package. And naturally, as a key launch title for the Xbox, Halo was a tour de force in terms of technology on display. In many ways, Halo stands as one of the first big titles to focus heavily on the use of programmable shaders and more advanced rendering techniques. The visual effects here greatly exceed what was possible in the likes of PlayStation 2 or even most PCs of that day. The bump map textures and the way lighting reacts to these surfaces, for instance, made a huge impression, with textures exhibiting actual depth based on the position of lights. Specular highlights were also used effectively throughout to further enhance this depth. This particular texture here aboard a Covenant craft especially stands out. And speaking of textures, Halo features incredibly high-resolution texture work, especially for the time. While the seams are certainly evident today, there was a level of detail present in the assets that really stood out at the time. Halo also makes use of high-frequency detail texture maps to give the impression of greater detail at a close proximity, a feature first pioneered back in Unreal in 1998 actually. Then we have the sun filtering through the trees here. It's another effect that left quite an impression back in the day. It's beautiful both artistically and technically. Of course, the skyboxes also played a huge role in setting the stage here, and nobody does skyboxes quite like Bungie. They were fully 3D and animated to boot. But the immense scale these skyboxes suggested wasn't just limited to non-playable areas. The size of the maps themselves are an achievement here as well. Each mission in the game can take upwards of 20 to 30 minutes or more to complete, and presents huge areas filled with rolling hills, twisting interiors, and large chasms. The game strategically makes use of loading hallways between areas to keep the action flowing, and these loading screens are very brief, but the areas between each loading tunnel could be massive and complex on its own. Halo, like other Xbox games of the time, also launched with full support for Dolby Digital 5.1, offering gamers true surround sound, if you had the gear of course. But beyond that, Marty O'Donnell's soundtrack is implemented brilliantly here, with tracks weaving dynamically in and out of the game based on what's happening on screen, and the music is unforgettable of course. There was also the conditional dialogue, randomly pulled lines that were recorded and used for soldiers and aliens alike. This really helped give the game personality, especially the English used for the grunts. Then we have the physics. Before the days of Havoc and other middleware solutions, Bungie had created its own robust physics engine. Vehicles reacted realistically while driving around the world, rubble and dirt kicked up by the tires collides with the terrain naturally, and those riding within the vehicles reacted very nicely to the driving model. This is what ultimately led to things like the original Warthog jump video. Just awesome. Of course, the AI here is just fantastic as well, with enemies that react to the player in ways that had never before been seen back in 2001. Even today, the enemies put up a good fight and are interesting to engage with. Unlike many modern shooter campaigns, such as Call of Duty, where you simply hide behind cover and take out distant enemies, the Covenant are very active and they move around the battlefield all the time, resulting in a very dynamic experience. When looking at games from the past, I always enjoy seeing them rendered out in different ways to get a better idea of how they're made. Thanks to the Xbox archivist Andrew Borman, we actually get a look at Halo running on real Xbox hardware in wireframe mode. And it definitely gives us an interesting new look at the game in motion. Now it's interesting to see the raw triangles used here to build each scene, and it gives us an idea of how the Xbox is drawing each of these areas. It's not as geometrically dense as, say, Metroid Prime, which would release a year later, but the game focuses more on shading and sense of scale than anything else. You can also see the calling and loading in action here, as some scenes become visible based on the position of the player. This debug build also allows for a third-person perspective. Now, obviously, the game isn't designed to be played this way, and it is obvious that the animation doesn't really work in this perspective either, but it's still neat to see either way, I think. Now, in terms of frame rate, Halo aims for 30 frames per second, with vertical sync engaged and proper frame pacing present. During many scenes, it actually gets there, and the impression is that the game runs okay overall. You can see in this scene that we're actually getting a mostly stable level of performance here, and it feels good to play. It's a smooth 30 frames per second. Now, the game does tend to bog down pretty hard during major firefights, with dips into the low 20s and sometimes even below. Truth be told, it actually tends to feel kind of similar to many PS3 and 360 era shooters that would follow though, so it's definitely not unplayable by any means. It's a far cry from the low performance seen in Rare's excellent but choppy Nintendo 64 shooters. So the overall performance in the campaign then is pretty much what you see here. Quiet moments of exploration are met with a smooth, mostly stable 30 frames per second. You can drive around in your Warthog and everything feels pretty good. But when you jump into the big firefights, the frame rate definitely dips pretty hard. And for a launch game pushing cutting edge techniques, it's actually not that bad. It just wouldn't stand up in a modern game. Now of course, the single-player, full-screen campaign is just one way to play Halo, and thanks to the help of some friends, I was able to spend an evening digging back into the split-screen options included with the game. So let's kick off with a 4-player Slayer match on a single system. Performance does vary a lot here based on the map, so I started off with Blood Gulch. Here we actually see a mostly stable level of performance as well. Coming from the previous generation of 4-player games, this is a massive improvement and it feels quite playable. Canoodling around the map in a Warthog is still a ton of fun, and you can imagine that all the way back in 2001, this would have felt very, very good indeed. But if we switch over to Damnation, a map with a lot of additional shaders and much more advanced scene geometry, we actually start to see some performance issues really crop up here. It can get pretty choppy at points once the combat kicks into gear, and it does impact the gameplay experience. But still, even at its worst, it is better than a typical Nintendo 64 title, so it did still feel like a genuine leap. It's a shame we don't see more games today with split-screen options like this, but then again, modern renderers do make this rather difficult. But now we come to one of the best features in the game, the 2-player cooperative mode. Okay, so being able to play through the entire campaign like this is an amazing feature, and the wide field of view actually helps make it feel quite playable as well. But as you can see, this is where the frame rate starts to bog down the hardest. Even here in this first mission aboard the Pillar of Autumn, one of the simplest maps in the game, the performance drops pretty hard and it definitely impacts playability. So most of you are probably pretty familiar with all of this then. But it is interesting to finally see real frame rate numbers applied to the game. And we see that it's not that bad, but it's not that optimal either. But for a launch game, it worked pretty well. Of course, it's not just the tech that helped Halo succeed in 2001. The core game design behind Halo is also brilliant. To start with, Halo made great strides in making a shooter feel great on a gamepad, something we take for granted today. And the subtle auto-aim was used to improve the experience all around. At the time, there was no other game that felt as good as Halo, at least on the shooter front. On top of that, focus was placed on alternative attacks. Melee, for instance, plays a large tactical role here thanks to its strength, as did the single-button grenades. Then we have the limitation of just 2 weapons, which along with those grenades meant that players wouldn't need to fiddle with any weapon wheels here. Everything you needed was always one button press away, and I think this is key. This streamlined design ties into the shield and health system. This encouraged players to play differently than in traditional shooters. It made it possible to enjoy the game on the hardest difficulty, which is legendary, by eliminating the need to account for different levels of health for each encounter. Developers didn't need to worry about whether a player would come in with 5 health or 100 health to tune it. Now, I don't think that health packs are inherently bad though. Each has their place depending on the game, but the implementation of the shield and health system in Halo was nearly perfect. Bungie did a great job here. All of this is glued together with strategic movement and the rock, paper, scissors approach to weapon balance. Different weapons could impact players in different ways, especially in multiplayer. And knowing how each weapon and power-up behaves was critical. Just a couple examples. Plasma weapons, for instance, slow the turning speed of players being attacked with such a weapon. So even if they have a shotgun, if you come up behind them with a plasma weapon, they may not be able to turn around to use it in time. Then there's things like the overshield, which allows for a brief window of invincibility once picked up. These are just 2 minor examples, but this is the type of thinking that helped make positioning and weapon choice central pillars of the game. It wasn't just about getting the most powerful weapon, it was about learning how to use all of the tools in the toolbox. Now, of course, the Xbox did not launch with support for Xbox Live. It didn't exist yet, so most players were limited to playing Halo in split screen, as you see here. But it was possible to link up multiple boxes and create a LAN party of sorts, something I did a lot of back in the day. Now beyond that, fans also created a utility known as XB Connect that enabled you to use the LAN features over the internet for real online play all the way back in 2002. It was a crazy time. Then of course we have the narrative. The original Halo tells a simple but tightly written story that works quite well within the game itself. The main thing for me here is the twist. The introduction of the Flood remains one of the most brilliant mid-game surprises I can recall. If you've played Halo early on, with no knowledge of what was to come back in 2001, the Flood felt like a genuine surprise. So to put this into perspective, consider this. Up until the halfway point of the game, you're only fighting the Covenant. All of the marketing material was focused on the Covenant, and for all intents and purposes, that was the point of the game. So to go and introduce a completely new enemy halfway through the game that the player never saw coming was a pretty bold move. So when you first arrive at the facility where the Flood are kept, you see a lot of Covenant that have been killed, and Marines freaking out, at least the ones that are still alive. Master Chief eventually uncovers a helmet of a fallen soldier, and is able to view a record of what happened, which is what you're seeing here. So it's basically told through a flashback of sorts stored as a log, and the atmosphere of this level is also very different from what you've encountered previously. While I have issues with actually fighting the Flood, their surprise reveal remains something special. Which brings us to an issue that is often raised when discussing Halo, the level design itself. Halo does feature some of the most brilliantly designed levels in FPS history. Nobody is going to forget the Silent Cartographer. But on the flip side, nobody really wants to remember the library either. There are points in Halo where you spend a lot of time traversing through samey looking environments, and it can become a bit draining at times. But I feel that still the game manages to work out over well, and here's why. So excluding the library, which I can admit is actually pretty tedious, most of the levels work through sheer gameplay variety rather than scenery variety. That is, while many rooms can wind up looking similar, the actual physical design and enemy placements enable unique, interesting firefights in each and every one of them. Assault on the control room fits the bill here. You do traverse the same bridge multiple times and encounter a lot of similar looking rooms, but the actual battles that occur within each area are well designed and unique. The main source of fatigue simply stems from the repeating scenery, which unfortunately was likely the result of limited development time in preparing the game for launch, but there is more variety here than you might think. Still, despite such flaws, I feel that the original Halo is a gem of a game that shines brightly even today. It feels incredible to play, and really helped the shooter genre thrive on consoles in a world where PCs once dominated. So it should come as no surprise that Halo would be playable on a great many devices going forward. It was never destined to remain exclusively on the original Xbox. The first port of Halo comes in the form of Halo for the PC. Handled by Gearbox Software, Halo arrived almost 2 years after its appearance on the Xbox and offered PC players a chance to enjoy the game as well, making up somewhat for its initial cancellation when Microsoft purchased Bungie. The port had a real impact and spawned a large, vibrant community that is still active today, but at the same time, it's also missing a number of key visual features, resulting in an inferior looking game. But first, let's take a look at the options on display here. Halo's option menu was fairly simple, and it allowed for the expected PC improvements such as increased resolution and the adjustment of various details. Now in 2003, pixel shading was finally becoming common on the PC, and this was key in porting Halo to the platform. You needed a graphics card which could support pixel shading in order to accurately display Halo. However, interestingly, it is actually possible to play Halo in fixed function mode as well without any shader usage at all. The resulting visuals are decidedly less impressive and give the game a very different look, but it is neat to see. Basically, this means that all of the advanced lighting, shading, and texturing are removed from the game. This mode was basically intended for graphics cards which lacked the features that were introduced in the GeForce 3 and 4 graphics cards. The real cards, mind you. Remember, Nvidia did sell cards like the GeForce 4 MX, which actually lacked pixel shader capabilities and was really just a rebranding of the GeForce 2 MX. Again, a simplified budget card. Another serious issue on the PC though ties into the animation system. Essentially, all of the animation was keyframed at 30 frames per second by Bungie, and when playing the game at higher frame rates, there is a mismatch between camera movement and animation. Enemies, vehicles, physics, and weapons all update at a lower frame rate, while the rest of the game plays out at 60 frames per second. It looks kinda strange in motion and can be rather jarring. But really, like I said, this isn't really the fault of Gearbox here. The animation was never designed for higher frame rates, and the team was forced to deal with decisions made by Bungie during its original development. All of the physics and animation are done at 30 frames per second, which is the target frame rate for the Xbox version. Now you can also cap the game at 30 frames per second if you desire a more consistent presentation, but then it winds up feeling pretty terrible with the mouse. Mouse input at 30 frames per second is never good. But the real issue here is the lack of visual effects present throughout the game. Many of these are minor, of course, but it does impact the overall look. Right from this cutscene, for instance, you can start to see differences in textures and shading. Take a look at the Pelican's Hall in this scene. When we jump down to the beach then, notice the missing water shaders as well, in addition to the missing specular texture layer on the assault rifle. It's much flatter looking on the PC. The missing water shaders are also evident here in this scene next to the waterfall. The mist around the water also appears to be a little bit reduced. Or how about the skybox here? It's rendered differently again on the PC with reduced shading quality and lower resolution textures there along the ground. Or Covenant shields, they're also rendered differently on the PC. One of the most severe issues actually stems from the lack of fog here in this area. The sky winds up looking awful in the scene on the PC. Interestingly, when using the fixed function mode without shaders, there is actually some fog. And this is just a small summary of some of these problems, but these issues do persist across the game as a whole. There are so many small missing effects, shaders, and textures in this version of Halo that it winds up feeling somewhat unpolished in the end. But let's not forget that it also has benefits. Despite the aforementioned animation issue, the game does run much smoother overall than it did on Xbox, and the higher resolution is of course fantastic. Plus, being able to go beyond the trilinear texture filtering on Xbox definitely enhances the texture quality. But where the game really comes alive on PC is the multiplayer and modding scene. In 2004, Gearbox released the tools used to create Halo content to the community and released a standalone version of the game called Halo Custom Edition. Now, I have to admit, I don't actually have a lot of experience here using the Custom Edition, but in investigating what's going on here, you can see that there's a lot of creativity happening within the scene. This video from CE3, for instance, showcases just how crazy the modding can get, and this is only from the last couple of years. That's right, more than a decade later, people are still playing Halo on the PC and pushing the engine to the limits. It's a very cool thing to see. Ultimately though, Halo on the PC is not a bad way to play Halo. It has its shortcomings for sure, but it also has a lot of advantages that cannot be ignored. Unfortunately, these shortcomings would wind up having consequences down the line, as we'll see in a moment. But before we get there, we need to jump forward to 2005 and the launch of Xbox 360. One of the key features announced early for the 360 was backwards compatibility, but unlike the incredible implementation on Xbox One, the feature was never really fleshed out very well on 360 and required a lot of additional work in order to use it. It should come as no surprise then that Halo was one of the supported games, and it does actually look pretty good when running on a 360. Image quality is enhanced all around and the game just looks cleaner and smoother on Xbox 360. And as this is basically just the Xbox version, you know what to expect in terms of visuals, and thankfully the emulation is actually pretty accurate in this respect. But unfortunately, performance isn't where it should be. The average frame rate on 360 is a lot lower than it was on the original Xbox, with more severe drops popping up throughout, both in single player and multiplayer modes. This round on Damnation here definitely runs a little bit slower than what we saw on the original Xbox earlier. Now, jumping over to the single-player campaign then, we see some pretty serious drops during these large firefights. Now, granted, scenes like this battle on the Silent Cartographer didn't run that well on an original Xbox to begin with, but when you switch over to Xbox 360, the average frame rate is 2 to 5 frames per second slower on average, I'd say. It drops in all the same places, but the drops are more severe. Still, once you get out of these particularly busy scenes, the game does actually pick up and start to run pretty well again. Ultimately, it's not a bad way to play Halo, and you do get a pretty accurate presentation and decent image quality here, but just keep in mind that the performance isn't going to be quite where it should be. Bungie would go on to continue developing Halo for years before seeking its freedom from Microsoft. Its final game is Halo Reach, but the franchise would continue on the Xbox as Microsoft retained the rights to the franchise. A new studio, 343 Industries, was then started up to handle Halo going forward, and while working on the next major installment, which was Halo 4, Microsoft decided to invest in a full-on remake of the original Halo, set to release 10 years after the original game. It was called Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary, a joint project between 343 and Saber Interactive. Saber used its own graphics engine technology and combined that with Bungie's code to create a unique take on Halo. Halo Anniversary features entirely rebuilt graphics and modified audio alongside the option to play the game using the original Halo assets. You could switch on the fly between the two modes by hitting the back button. It was a pretty neat feature, though the lengthy fade between switching modes is definitely a little bit annoying, even though I understand it's necessary. Now, I did enjoy seeing this new take on the original Halo, much like I do have an appreciation for something like Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes. It's fun looking at a game you know and seeing it rebuilt with fresh art from a new perspective. Unfortunately, even though it is kinda cool, I do feel that these new visuals are somewhat out of place. It doesn't really blend well with Bungie's original designs and winds up feeling like kind of a different game in many ways. Now, the visuals are pretty good technically though, as many modern rendering features were introduced, including things like shadow maps and improved shading. It really does look more like an actual 360 game this time, as opposed to the original Xbox game. What do you guys think about these enhanced graphics? Another nice feature here is the inclusion of support for 3D TVs. Yep, it was released during that era and fully supports the option, one of the few 360 games that did. Somehow, more than many other games from this period, Halo actually works really well in this mode. I used to play it back on my HMZ T1 headset, and it was glorious. There's a real sense of scale to the environments that you don't normally get when you play it on a TV screen. Of course, on the flip side, I feel that it's missing some of the original game's attention to detail. The sun filtering through the trees, for instance, has been eliminated when using the remastered graphics, which is kind of a downgrade, don't you think? It also suffers from pretty serious performance issues. Not only does the frame rate regularly drop below 30 frames per second during gameplay, but it also suffers from bad frame pacing as well. It really never manages to feel very fluid at all, and it kinda gives the impression that this is an unpolished product. In fact, while the frame rate can drop lower on the original Xbox version, I actually still feel that Bungie's version of Halo Combat Evolved offers a smoother overall experience in many ways, which is kind of a shame. You can see here that even when the serious performance dips calm down, we still have a lot of frame pacing errors, resulting in a rather jittery experience all around. It definitely doesn't feel great here. Even more disappointing is the fact that the classic mode graphics don't run very well either. Plenty of slowdown is still evident here, and we still have the frame pacing issues. So, even when playing in this mode, the game still feels worse than Bungie's original release on the Xbox at launch. Definitely a disappointment here. Let's not forget the cooperative split-screen mode. As with the campaign, performance is less than optimal here, and the field of view actually feels reduced compared to the original Xbox release, complete with a cropped weapon. Now, it is functional enough though, and it is ultimately still Halo, but it's disappointing that it doesn't run all that well here. It also suffers from many of the same issues as the original PC port from Gearbox. Again, check out the sky in this scene. Not great. Then we have the multiplayer mode. The multiplayer maps included here from the original Halo were redesigned, but instead of being integrated with the original gameplay, they were shoved into the framework of Halo Reach. It's all included on the disc, and it does feature many of those maps that you remember, but the core gameplay is completely different since it's basically just Halo Reach with a Halo 1 theme. Now, considering how popular the original Halo's multiplayer was, and the rise of Xbox Live since the launch of the original Halo, I always found this to be a very strange decision, and I'm sure budgetary and time constraints played a role in deciding this, since Saber Interactive likely didn't want to have to rebuild all the netcode to work on Xbox Live. But still, it is a disappointment. Ultimately then, the Halo Anniversary package for Xbox 360 does come off as a bit of a disappointment. The performance really isn't where it should be, the enhanced graphics aren't great, the modified music isn't great, and the whole thing just feels kinda sloppy. It was an interesting idea, but I don't feel that the package came together all that well in the end. But fortunately, this isn't the end of the story. Years after the release of Halo Anniversary, Microsoft saw fit to release all of the games in the franchise in a single package, known as the Master Chief Collection. And it is here where you can find perhaps one of the finest iterations of Halo. The port of Halo Combat Evolved included in this collection is essentially an enhanced version of Anniversary, with a number of fixes. It now runs at a full 1920 by 1080 at 60 frames per second in Classic mode, featuring some of the missing effects, though not all, and features completely updated animations which now display at a full 60 frames per second. Yes, the limitation from the PC version has been lifted, and the results are fantastic. Okay, so some elements, such as the particles, still move at half rate, and cutscenes are limited by this animation issue, but the rest of the game is now operating at a perfect 60 frames per second. It is definitely the smoothest we've seen Halo run yet, and it feels wonderful. Now, it's interesting to compare the final version of Halo 1 released with the original version released on Xbox and see the differences. When comparing the remastered graphics up against the original Xbox version, yeah, it still doesn't look brilliant, but at least all of the issues from 360 are removed. But when you compare it in Classic mode, it actually feels pretty darn accurate. It's definitely an improvement over the PC original, and even in cases where it is missing something, the improved performance and clarity definitely makes it worth playing on Xbox One instead. The high level of performance, then, is precisely what makes this version so good. While playing in Classic mode, everything moves at a very stable 60 frames per second, without any performance oddities or problems. It's very smooth, and it feels great to play. Bouncing around on the Silent Cartographer map here in the Warthog, you can really appreciate the new fluid motion. If you remember on the PC, even the camera motion while driving a vehicle ran at 30 frames per second, so to see the whole thing running like this, well, it's just great. Now, the remastered visuals do tend to struggle somewhat, unfortunately, and drop regularly below 60 frames per second, but it is still a far cry from the sub 30 FPS of the Xbox 360 iteration. It's not bad, it's just not perfect. And what about co-op? Well, unfortunately, we start to see problems with the performance here on Xbox One with regular drops below 60 frames per second. It's still faster than any previous Halo to date, but not as smooth as we would have liked. The remastered visuals, of course, struggle even more in co-op, just as they do in single player, but that was expected and isn't my preferred way to play the game anyways. But the multiplayer, they nailed it. You can now play the original Halo 1 multiplayer maps using all of the original features, and it looks marvelous. A smooth 60 frames per second, and all of the gameplay is fully intact. You can even get online with it now if you want. So while the Master Chief Collection did launch with some issues, the iteration of Halo 1 included here is pretty amazing. Sure, it could still be better with some anti-aliasing for the classic mode for instance, but it has become my favorite way to replay Halo since its release. And continue to replay the game I will. If you couldn't tell by the length of this video, I absolutely adore Halo, and revisiting it this week has demonstrated to me that the game still stands the test of time. This is one of the best playing shooters ever made, and jumping back even into the 4-player split screen thing was a really good time. After taking the time to explore and replay each version of Halo, minus the Macintosh port of 2003 by the way, because I don't have the hardware to test on, here are my final thoughts on the various versions. The Xbox One version of Halo is perhaps the single best way to replay Halo today. It looks great, runs like a dream, and comes closest to matching the original Xbox version visually. This is a great version of Halo. Following that, we have the original Xbox release. I have a lot of nostalgia for it, and it is ultimately truest to Bungie's vision. It looks good, it sounds good, and it's nice to replay this game on the original hardware. This is then followed by the PC version, which, though lacking some visual effects, still remains a solid way to enjoy Halo today, and it does boast a massive active community if you're into the multiplayer. Then there is the backwards compatible version of Halo, which is basically the Xbox version running on a 360 with a lower overall frame rate. Lastly, we have the original Halo Anniversary release for Xbox 360, which runs somewhat poorly, suffers from frame pacing issues, and really doesn't offer much over any other version of the game. The only reason I'd recommend picking this one up is if you have a 3D TV or some way of playing 3D games, in which case it's pretty neat. Still, there's really no wrong way to play Halo. The game is great in all forms. And with that, we've come to the end of another episode. I hope you enjoyed my take on the Bungie saga and found something new and interesting within, even though the story is pretty well known at this point. But thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of this very long video, and if you did enjoy it, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us on Twitter. And of course, if you are subscribing to the digitalfoundry.net site, be sure to check it out as well, because a high quality version of this video is up there right now. But until next time, stay retro.